Hey, there's Yuki.
Yeah.
All right, Grace, you may start there.
And Blythe, cool.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grace, and I'm the events producer at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington. I would like to welcome you to our event in celebration of author Trisha T. Pritikin's new book, The Hanford Plaintiffs. Thank you all for supporting a local independent bookstore. University Bookstore is the oldest independent bookstore in the region. In fact, we're celebrating our 120th anniversary this year. We're always grateful for your patronage, and especially now in this pandemic year, where the fate of bookstores and all small businesses is uncertain. We're currently open to the public 12 to 4 Monday through Sunday, and also offer curbside pickup. Please check our website, ubookstore.com, for the latest information about our hours. The Hanford Plaintiffs, Voices from the Fight for Atomic Justice, introduces the stories of 24 personal injury plaintiffs in litigation filed by people injured by Hanford's decades of secret off-site radiation releases. These stories provide real-life illustration of the devastation to health and life that is a result of production, testing, and use of nuclear weapons. The Hanford Plaintiffs won first prize at the 2020 San Francisco Book Festival in the history category. Trisha's worked for over 30 years for justice for those who, like her family, now face radiogenic cancer and other serious illnesses following exposure to ionizing radiation downwind of Manhattan Project and Cold War nuclear weapons production and testing sites. She is an attorney and former occupational therapist, and this is her first book. She'll be in conversation today with Karen Dorn Steele. In her long career as an environmental and investigative reporter, Karen Dorn Steele unmasked nuclear secrecy and won a series of major national reporting awards for the Spokesman Review, the daily newspaper in Spokane, Washington. In the 1980s, she broke the long suppressed story of Hanford's radiation emissions during World War II and the Cold War, including the Green Run, a 1949 military experiment that spread dangerous radiation throughout eastern Washington and eastern Oregon with no public warning. We would also like to welcome our two panelists, Tom Bailie and Bob McCormick. Just a few more things before we get started. We'll post the link to the book through the chat periodically, and you can click on it to be rerouted to our website. This event is being recorded and will be on University Bookstore's YouTube channel in about 2 to 3 days. If you have any questions for the author or any of the panelists, please put them in the chat field and we'll pull them at the end of the event to ask each question. And now I will turn it over to Trisha and Karen.
Thank you so much, Grace, and also to your two very wonderful tech people who have been helping us. Great introductions. I wanted to say I am a UW alumna, and therefore I'm quite excited and happy to be participating in a book launch via UW Bookstore. Thank you so much. This was scheduled originally as an in-person book launch, but has been converted to a virtual book launch due to the pandemic. And I love the fact that it's actually increased the number of people who can participate in these events by being virtual. So it's actually a benefit in that way. The Hanford Plaintiffs tells the story of 24 former personal injury plaintiffs in the mass toxic tort litigation called In re Hanford Nuclear Reservation litigation. All of the plaintiffs were civilians. Some were workers. Others were the children of people who lived in the farmlands, children of workers, people whose family had no relationship to the Hanford Reservation. The common fact amongst them all is they lived downwind or downriver of the Hanford nuclear reservations during Hanford's 40 plus years of plutonium production. The Hanford Plaintiff's introduction is written by Karen Dorn Steele, who's a true hero to Hanford downwinders. She's the investigative reporter who broke the story of cancers and other diseases in the mid-'80s within farm communities across the Columbia River from the Hanford site. The foreword is authored by two of the attorneys who represented the plaintiffs, Tom Folds of Seattle and Richard Iman of Spokane. So not everyone knows too much about the Hanford Reservation, so I just want to give a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with the site. Hanford, which is located in south central Washington state on the Columbia River, was a federal nuclear weapons production site where the plutonium was produced for the world's first test of an atomic bomb, the Trinity test, detonated July 16th, 1945 near Alamogordo, New Mexico. Hanford's plutonium was also used in Fat Man, the bomb that was detonated over Nagasaki and killed many, many, many thousands of people there on August 9th, 1945. Many of the atmospheric atomic tests conducted by the US at the Nevada test site and within the Pacific Proving Grounds, which included the Marshall Islands during the Cold War, also showering people with radioactive fallout, also used plutonium that was produced at Hanford. So from startup of the facility as part of the Wartime Manhattan Project in late 1944 and continuing for more than 40 years thereafter, Hanford operators secretly discharged the radioactive byproducts of plutonium production to the air throughout much of the Pacific Northwest and into the waters of the Columbia River. The public did not learn about these releases until 1986 when the Department of Energy, responding to repeated Freedom of Information Act requests and mounting public concern over Hanford's safety, finally declassified thousands of early operating records revealing Hanford's radioactive contamination of air and water throughout the Pacific Northwest. Even now, more than 30 years after Hanford's secrets were revealed in this declassification, the stories of cancers and other radiogenic diseases in Hanford, Downwind, and Downriver populations are not well known, and these are stories that the powers that be would prefer to see swept under the rug. That's one of the reasons that the plaintiffs and well, I'm one of the plaintiffs, but that's one of the reasons we decided to put our stories together, for our voices together are far more powerful than each of us speaking individually. Now, Inree Hanford Nuclear Reservation litigation initially involved almost 5,000 plaintiffs who filed personal injury actions against the former Hanford contractors who had operated Hanford during the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, which were the decades of plutonium production and off-site radiation release at the facility. And as I mentioned, the stories in the book are the stories of children of farmers across the Columbia from Hanford, children of farm families in the Columbia Basin, the children of anthropologists who excavated the Whitman mission near Walla Walla, children of military families in Idaho, and the children of Hanford workers. I want to say that some of the stories in the book are those of workers at Hanford, and workers at Hanford are also downwinders. Anyone who is within the downwind path of the radionuclides release can be considered a downwinder. Oftentimes there's an artificial distinction made between workers and downwinders, but some of our stories are those of workers as well. And many of these individuals now suffer with cancers and other diseases believed caused by childhood exposure to Hanford's radiation. The litigation dragged on for more than 25 years, and it was one of the longest civil actions in the country. Many people feel that the plaintiffs did not achieve justice in this litigation. The Hanford plaintiffs takes a look at the Hanford downwinder litigation alongside the personal injury litigation filed by Nevada test site downwinders. That's called Irene Allen v. US. Looks at the outcome of both, looks at the injustice against the downwinders in both situations, and discusses the possible alternative of a national compensation program based on the Nuclear Workers' Compensation Program that's currently compensating workers at Manhattan Project and Cold War production and testing sites. It's our collective hope that our stories will raise public awareness of the human toll of the Hanford facility and of the accompanying importance of public and congressional oversight over government actions. Hanford operated virtually without oversight, and the result was grave injury to the public that took decades to be revealed. This must not happen again. May our sacrifices and our stories help prevent another Hanford. Now, I want to begin today in conversation with Karen, who's one of my very favorite people in the world, and again, my hero. I want to start with talking a little bit about how we first met. And it was actually Karen's story in the Spokesman Review that alerted me to what might be the cause of all these mysterious health problems I'd had for years. I would happen to be visiting my grandmother in Spokane and read one of her stories in the Spokesman Review. I'll forever be thankful for that. So I have a couple of questions that I would love to ask her. And the first is, do you remember when we first crossed paths, Karen?
Yes, I went back and thought about that a bit. And before we actually got to know each other in the 1990s, I'd already done about a decade of Hanford reporting on problems at the Purex weapons plant that had been restarted in the Reagan administration, on farm families near Hanford. You'll hear more about that in a little while. The people who are keeping death maps in the area. And also working with activist groups and other newspapers to force disclosure of the documents that Tricia talked about. And then when those documents were released, I had broken the story of the Green Run. And Hanford really hadn't admitted at all that Hanford had harmed people until 1990, when it promised follow-up studies of the downwinders. So that's when I met you. It was during that intense battle over who would control those studies. The downwinders wanted independent scientists to do the work, but they got studies instead that were controlled by the weapons makers. And I think I went back in my files. I first quoted you in a November 1994 story on downwinder testimony in Spokane. That was when the Clinton White House advisory panel on radiation releases came, and Tricia gave very eloquent testimony at that event.
Oh, thank you. Well, you know, I was trying to remember when I first met you, and I remember a young red-haired woman with notebook in hand in the first row of the audience at many of the meetings that I attended in I think it was the late 80s, and that was convened by state and federal officials trying to contain the public outrage over the 1986 revelations that Hanford had secretly released radiation. And I remember you in the audience at a lot of our Hanford Health Effects Subcommittee meetings. I mean, and after I read many of your stories, your presence was comforting. I always hoped you'd be there. You know, you were like comfort for me. And if I saw you there with your notebook, I knew you were going to write something and the public would understand what was happening. Because oftentimes I didn't understand what in the heck was going on. There's just too many agencies and too many things getting thrown at us. But when I read your articles, you would explain it all in a way that made sense to me. And so your presence was really comforting. And also, your work was crucial to revealing to the world the human toll of Hanford operations, the way you interpret things. You don't just say, I was at a meeting and this happened. You say, and this is what it means. It was very helpful. I wrote down here just a thought. Karen's reporting was the only light of hope in some really dark times for the downwinders. And her role was so important to all of us that she has been deemed Mother Downwinder, I think by Tom, and maybe a few others, because without your investigative reporting, the downwinders would have been overlooked. I'm convinced of this. Okay, my second question to you, Karen, is, did you encounter any resistance at your paper to your work on the downwinders story?
Well, in the early 80s, you know, the Spokesman Review had been a kind of a provincial paper. It had never covered Hanford. It had just picked up Associated Press stories when new plants opened or closed. And after Tom, you'll hear his story in a little bit here, but after I met with him in his community, I did have to convince my editors that there was a real story there. They said, well, why? I mean, they've always told us that Hanford is safe. Isn't it? Well, what is this? But then when I went and met with the farmers, found the documents that backed up a lot of what they were saying, then my paper said, you're on to something, go. But it wasn't automatic.
Ugh. I am so thankful you persevered, because without that, where would we be, honestly? Okay, I've heard that you received some threats on your home phone when your kids were little, demanding that you stop your stories on the downwinders. Is this the case?
That did happen. It happened. There was a flurry of those sort of threatening calls after my first stories on the production problems at the Purex weapons plant, plutonium plant, which had been reopened in the early 1980s to produce plutonium for the big Reagan administration arms buildup. Basically, people said, quit quit reporting on this, and they accused me of being a unpatriotic, being a communist, that kind of thing. But the most disturbing is when they called my 12-year-old daughter, Blythe, my youngest daughter, at home, and said things are going to happen to your mom. That was sort of beyond the pale. So, but that's that happens in these situations. Passions run high.
Yikes, that's just terrible. I'm so sorry. I'm so glad nothing happened. Do you recall your reporting of the medical monitoring program that was recommended by it's a long named agency, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry for the downwinders in 1997? And that was one part of the question. The second part is, how did you think the impasse over funding of the program would resolve?
Well, I do remember that. And in June of 1998, I did a profile of you, and it was because you had filed suit in federal court in Spokane to force the Department of Energy to pay $12.9 million to screen 14,000 downwinders. These were people who had been exposed as children to Hanford emissions and who got estimated doses of at least 10 rads to their thyroid gland. And that 10 rad dose is a dose which increases cancer risks by 20 to 50%. And I sincerely thought that Congress would prevail and insist on this study. Senator Patty Murray pushed for it, but it didn't happen. The Department of Energy said it would have to take the money out of its nuclear cleanup funds, which was a really dubious excuse. And there was another factor too, though. The demise of medical monitoring was also affected by the government's decision that same year not to screen any atomic bomb test victims for cancer. So the whole idea of finding out what happened to people downwind from nuclear weapons production sites and the bomb test site just went out the window. It didn't happen.
Yeah, after so many years of working on it with the Agency for Toxic Substances, I was just like, that was one of the tough ones for the downwinders. I mean, really, we just get bad news after bad news. Your reporting was excellent, though, on it.
Thank you.
I got a last question for you. I've heard rumors you are currently working on your memoir, and which is great. Will you be including your observations on the Hanford downwinder litigation in your work?
Yes, I will. My focus is going to be on this long suppressed Hanford story, how it was revealed in the 1980s and 90s, and what happened during that 25-year-long Hanford downwinders trial. It's a very dramatic story.
I can hardly wait. I really can hardly wait to read it. I bet you have a lot of files.
A garage full.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, now I'm going to turn things over now to Karen, who will be talking with Tom Bailie, and they have a very long relationship. Tom is a farmer in a small town across the Columbia River from the Hanford facility, and in the mid-80s, he contacted Karen to let her know about cancers and other mysterious health issues in his neighbors. Bailie or Tom suspected that an undisclosed radioactive or other toxic release from Hanford might have something to do with these health issues. Little did you know, right? Okay.
Yeah, so Tom, I have a few questions for you then. What was it that motivated you to invite me down to meet your neighbors in the first place?
I drank too much alcohol at a cocktail party that you were at. Opened my mouth when you asked me if I noticed anything strange down there living next to Hanford. I said my famous line of, "Oh, the Hanford doesn't do anything except kill or deform a few sheep once in a while." Of course, your instincts went right on point. And you said, "Well, could I come down and visit sometime?" And I said, "Absolutely, anytime you want, you're welcome." I invited you down.
And that's what happened. I went down and Tom started to introduce me to his neighbors. And I recall we were sitting around having coffee in the Basin City Cafe with some neighbors, and they pointed us to a family. What did they tell you?
They said I was crazy.
Do you remember what they said about the Andrzejewskis?
Yeah, Mrs. Andrzejewski is a pretty straightforward woman. I've always been afraid of her. I I was shocked she kept a death map, and her and I never really talked about anything about Hanford. But we left the cafe, and you and I drove over to Anajeski's house, and that's when I realized something really happened. There was really a story here. She backed me up.
Yeah, that was extremely interesting. And the Andrzejewskis had this map of very early cancer and incidents and heart attacks in that entire farming community. And it was their form of citizen epidemiology. And it got me started looking for the documents. So I wrote my first big story on you and your community in 1985. It was called Downwinders Living with Fear. It had a sidebar on the sheep deaths, which turned out to be a big deal. Hundreds of sheep deaths in the winter of 60 to 61. But after my story came out, what reaction did you get in your community from that publicity?
Anger and fear. Fear that we wouldn't be able to sell our crops, that they were contaminated, and anger that how could I question good old Hanford?
So they weren't happy.
They were not happy at all.
Well, it's 35 years later, and of course, a lot of more information came out about Hanford, the Green Run. 1986, the documents were released. The Chernobyl accident happened. N-reactor was shut down because it was a plant very similar at Hanford to the Chernobyl facility. But it's 35 years have gone by, and if you could write this history yourself, what would you say about what was done to the Downwinders, and also how the Hanford lawsuit was resolved?
Us Downwinders were used as guinea pigs in a human experimentation project that involved radioactive food. That's what I believe. That's what I've been putting this all together. And the lawsuit was nothing but a clusterfuck.
It was resolved. Yes, it was resolved with a lot of uncertain outcomes, unresolved outcomes for the Downwinders. So I gather then you do not feel that the U.S. government has been properly accountable to the citizens exposed to radiation from nuclear weapons plants.
It's treason what they did. Treason is all I can say.
Would you have liked a government apology?
We got one from Bill Clinton. He apologized to us, and then he sent a missile into the Chinese embassy in Bosnia. And at the same time he did that, and it died, and it wasn't really publicized at all. And the one thing I've always wanted is the free thyroid medication for the radiation victims. I mean, at least they could buy the medication for the surviving guinea pigs.
That's a good suggestion, Tom. Okay, Tricia?
Well,
Thank you.
Medicare for all.
Thanks to both of you
You're
very much. I always love hearing the two of you talk together about the way back then. Now, I think a lot of people might not know how vast the airborne radiation area was from Hanford. I mean, you see maps, and some maps, if they're certain government maps, have little small areas in Washington state. But if you look at the maps that really document how far this radiation went, it went up into British Columbia, across Idaho to western Montana, northern Oregon, and of course, all through eastern Washington. It's a vast area, and all the way along the Columbia River. And the next person I'm going to talk to, his mom's story is the very first story in the book. And Charlotte Ray McCormick, Bob's mother, lived in a little town called Boardman, which is right along the Columbia River. Now the question becomes, can we show that photo or not? I'm not sure whether we can at this point. I don't know. I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that, but the family owned a boat, and they spent a lot of time on the river, water skiing and swimming. And they, like the rest of the public, were not aware that the waters of the Columbia River were radioactive. So Bob is with us today, and thank you very much, Bob, for participating. And I'm going to be asking you a couple of questions. Okay.
Okay.
Let's see. First, would you please let us know a bit about your mom and her childhood in Boardman?
Well, I'd like to thank you and everyone for this opportunity, this honor to represent my mom. And I know I won't do her justice, but my grandparents moved from Idaho to Boardman when my mom was like probably 5 years old. Oh, there's the picture.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
And this was my grandparents' house, where my mom was raised, mostly in out of Boardman. And if you look to the right of the house, you can see that fence. Right above that fence, you see a big power line and a hill, but you can see the Columbia River right over that fence on the right if you zoom in on it. And they relied on water, the Columbia, for their farming. They were farmers, ranchers. There you go. You can see it right there. And so they moved there. My mom went to school at Boardman. I think it was called Riverside School. They went to church there, and Boardman raised. She met my dad there. They met, and they relied heavily on the environment for food. And like you said, they fished, they hunted, they fished, and the water, the Columbia River was the lifeline for the economy out there. She was really involved in her community. She was at a young age. I have a picture. This is what she looked like. That was her, like 16 or 15. She had four of us kids. I have 3 older sisters, and right around 70, 68 is when the John Day Dam was being built. And I guess that's when they moved to Portland. And I found out the other day. She was very involved in her community. And do you want me to go on with her cancer, or?
Oh yeah, the next question will be, can you tell us about some of the health issues both your mom and some of your other relatives who lived in the area ended up suffering from?
It's really strange. Most of them, in fact, my mom didn't start getting sick until she was in her late mid 40s. And she was diagnosed with leukemia. I get them mixed up. And then she got diagnosed with and went through radiation treatment, and this was in the 80s. And and then she ended up passing away a few years later of lymphoma and in relapse. Then I saw a thing on the news on Hanford radiation. And then I started putting together, like, my grandma had uterine cancer. My oldest sister has 3 or 4 different types of cancer. She has a colostomy bag. She has to she's had most of her insides removed. And my second sister's had hysterectomies. My third sister has fibromyalgia and health concerns. I have health problems now. And in 1993, on December 18th, my mom died. And that was going to be 27 years ago here in a couple weeks. She was so loved in the community, my mom, and her family, her grandkids, her nieces, nephews, brothers came to her side to donate platelets. And now here it is, 27 years later. We thought it was maybe an isolated incident, but it's not. Come to find out, family members. Now my niece, my second sister's daughter, at 20 something, she was diagnosed with the exact same leukemia that my mom had, which her oncologist said was very rare. So she's hardly ever seen that. And now she's also has a nephropathy and different things. And so it's devastated our family. And it's really made me mistrust the government, especially when they spend millions and millions and millions of dollars defending their actions against plaintiffs like my mom and others. But then they won't supply the money, they pay off. I don't know. It's just really frustrating that they won't help take care of people that they hurt. And I've been looking at these 8mm videos recently, and I've seen how there's little parades. Everybody in the community was involved in these little parades that they had in Boardman and Irrigon and all that stuff. And I bet Tom knows about how all these kids would decorate their bikes and bring them down the stuff. And so they raised alfalfa, grew alfalfa, and that alfalfa, I found out, was sent places, and it was radioactive and milk, and it affected people. And she's missed big time, and it's, I don't know.
Your family's had so many people with cancers and other illnesses, really. I mean, you've had one. I think your story in the book, of all the stories, your family has probably had, well, it's not the most, but one of the highest number of family members who are ill. And how did you first learn about Hanford, or put that together that maybe possibly these health issues were caused by Hanford?
When my mom passed away in '93, I was reading either a newspaper, or I saw an article on KOIN News Channel 6 in Portland about Hanford. So I called them, and that's how I found out about it. And they did an actual article or a story on her. And then I got in contact with an attorney, Roy Huber, is it?
Haber, probably.
Haber, yeah, in Eugene. And he's the one that helped represent my mom. But it was pretty flooring to see how much resistance there was to any kind of accountability.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I think your case is very illustrative of how badly the litigation ended for people. I mean, yes, you did receive a settlement, but it was so small that it was almost an insult. I mean, really, I heard that so many times from people.
I know. I wanted to tell you, Tricia, I can't remember. My memory is I don't know what's going on, but I don't know if it's in your book or what. There's a story about a man who's in World War II in Japan fighting, and then his wife or somebody is back at the US, and so they dropped the bomb on Nagasaki to end the war, or Japan. But yet little did she know that she would spend a lot of years later on defending against the cancers that our own countries caused from developing that bomb.
Right. I think
he thought he was defending her, their country, but little did he know back home.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, there's a book, I think, I can't remember the author's name, but they refer to this as killing our own. We're killing our own while we're thinking, trying to defend our country at the same time. I think you're thinking about Jay Mullen's story. He was lived on a military base in Idaho for a while as a tiny kid. Yeah, but still, I'm glad that they ran a story. I'm glad they ran the article for you. This is a big question. One of these big questions. What do you want people to understand about Hanford and what has happened to the Downwinders?
I want people to know that it's one of the biggest atrocities that's happened in our country, of the government's lack of accountability when they've created a devastating bomb weapon. I mean, I understand different philosophies and stuff, but the safety, concerns that happened with the storage of the tanks and stuff, and the leaking and all that, is it unpatriotic to report that the radiation is leaking from a tank to the water, which is killing the people down water? It doesn't have any relevance to patriotism. It has relevance to accountability. And So I would want people to open your eyes to what's going on, at what's happened at Hanford, and please try to speak up and say something to your representative about it, because if the government knows they're going to be unaccountable with these things, they're just going to continue doing them, and people are going to continue getting rich at the hands of our loved ones.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so thankful to you and your family, and to Tom, and to everyone for being brave about sharing the stories and putting them together. The voices of all of us together in the book are even more powerful than one of us speaking. And when you read our stories, it's kind of incredible to me to see how many of us have more than one thing, happening, either a cancer and autoimmune diseases, or a cancer, autoimmune diseases, and in the case of women, not just women, let me say that, fertility problems, just there's patterns you can see repeated, and it helps when you see everybody's stories together. Because it looks like we have a little time, I'd like to just share my story quickly. I don't always do this in these events if we run out of time, but I'm another one of the plaintiffs, and what happened to me is very typical of what happened to a lot of people. First, it was about 10 years after we left Richland. We left when I was 10. I was born and raised in Richland, the daughter of 2 nuclear workers. We left Richland 10 years later, and it wasn't until I was about 18 that I started to feel the first symptoms of low-dose ionizing radiation exposure. There's a latency period that passes after people are exposed to low-dose ionizing radiation before the symptoms show up. And the first symptoms I had these were actually symptoms of autoimmune thyroiditis, but nobody knew that because the Department of Energy didn't reveal the radiation releases until 1986. And this was like 1960 something. So no one knew. No one knew what to look for. Even when I went to a doctor, they had no idea what was wrong with me. But I started gaining weight and losing it for no good reason. I started being very tired. And at the time we were living in Spain, because my dad had been transferred with General Electric from Richland to Spain, because there were fewer nuclear contracts happening in the United States at that time. And so my period stopped, and this upset the Spanish gynecologist greatly. They're very worried about a young woman with her period stopping. So they shipped me back to the US for medical care. They still didn't know what was wrong with me. I just, so eventually my period started up again, which is nice, but that I wasn't really well and I wasn't really sick for a while. And then I ended up at University of Washington in the 70s. And the first thing that happened there was I developed cat scratch fever with a big tumor on my neck. And when I went into the medical clinic, they said, this only happens to people with suppressed immune systems. Well, that's weird. Why was my immune system suppressed? It took me forever to get over that. I missed a lot of classes. And then just to make a long story short, I ended up going to law school in San Francisco at Hastings. That is University of California. And I was tired, but functional. But then I started having panic attacks. And I learned later that's part of the autoimmune process. As your thyroid is dying, you become hyperthyroid, then hypothyroid, then hyper, then hypo, until your thyroid finally dies. And the panic attacks were from the hyperthyroidism. And I had terrible headaches and pressure in my head. But still, no one knew what had happened at Hanford, so nobody knew to look for that. They tested me for lupus, MS, other autoimmune things, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong. My digestion became terrible. I couldn't keep food down. I started losing weight, a whole lot of weight. And so then I got married and I couldn't get pregnant. We didn't know what was wrong. So we were up visiting my grandmother in Spokane, and I happened to pick up the Spokesman Review, and there was an article by Karen. And it talked about radioiodine being released. And thank goodness, it said in the 1940s, radioiodine was released. And I thought, thank goodness. I was born in 1950, so I escaped. So those poor people who got exposed, Later, we learned that I was, the releases continued. They were still figuring this out at that time. So I took this back to the fertility clinic, and they gave me the proper test for thyroid function, which I hadn't had before, and revealed that I was supremely hypothyroid. They put me on thyroid meds. I was pregnant the next cycle, but then I was worried that I was going to pass something on to my kids. So I went to UCSF to try to research whether you could pass on problems from exposure to radioiodine. And the lifespan study out of Nagasaki and Hiroshima was there. That's all I could find. And they said, no problem if it's you're not going to pass anything on from radioiodine exposure. So I didn't worry. So I had a full-term baby, but both my kids now have issues. Let's see. And that's an issue for a lot of downwinders, the next generation, people with health issues. We don't know what we've passed on from our exposures. Then just quickly, if you look at my whole family, my only sibling died shortly after death. He was a part of a spike of neonatal deaths in the Hanford downwind area. And you can see these babies buried in the Walla Walla Cemetery, Pasco Cemetery, and the Richland Historic Cemetery. And Tom may know about other places where the babies are buried. There's just hundreds of babies from the same period, late 40s through the 50s and early 60s. I think someone needs to look into the death certificates for all these guys to find out what happened there. And then my mother died of aggressive malignant melanoma. My dad died of aggressive thyroid cancer. The whole family wiped out.
Mhm.
So, and then I received a very modest settlement. Embarrassingly modest settlement, which I used to fund this book. I thought that was a good use for it, and I still feel that way. It didn't cover everything because it was so small, but that's okay. And then my dad was compensated for his radiation injuries as a nuclear worker. This isn't a government apology, but it is acknowledgement that Hanford radiation exposures caused harm to workers and downwinders. At least it's that. Lastly, the net proceeds from the Hanford plaintiffs goes to the work of a Washington state nonprofit, Consequences of Radiation Exposure. Our mission is to advance and disseminate the understanding of the human toll of exposure to ionizing radiation from uranium mining, milling, or transport, nuclear weapons production, testing or use in warfare, nuclear reactor offsite releases, and related radiation exposures. Our website's located at www.corehanford.org. And there are quite a few people on this call today who participate in CORE as board members, and I really appreciate it because it's a volunteer organization. We put a lot of time in, and hopefully it's making our voice heard, so I'm thankful. So that's all I have. Grace, who is our host, we should move to questions, I think.
Hello, everyone. Yes, we do have a couple of questions. If you have any more, please write them in the chat. So this question is for everyone on the panel. It's from Raymond. It's, as a young person, I have difficulty forming a moral and political identity. How do you know that you're doing the right thing? Do you doubt yourself, and to what degree?
Whew. Wow, what a great question. That's wow. How do you know you're doing the right thing? Just to clarify the question, meaning in any instance, how do you know if you're doing the right thing, or with regard to the Hanford situation? Not sure. Karen, do you have any thoughts on this one? It's a big question.
Well, it is a big question, and it's a very big question. I like what Amy Goodman said, the host of Democracy Now! She says, go where the silence is and say something. So if there is, at least to me as a journalist, if there's silence about an issue, if there's threats against people who try to raise an issue, that in my inner compass tells me that there may be something there. It's not like, you don't come to the conclusions right away, but it gives you you have to have curiosity, you have to have stamina, and you cannot let people bully you. So I think all those things, if you develop a strong moral core, that's a huge step forward in dealing with any of these really controversial issues.
Yeah, the courage part is big too. Like with what you faced with the threatening calls, or what Tom faced with all the anger against him and speaking out. You have to be ready to be kind of isolated and believe in yourself. You really believe in yourself. You may not have a whole lot of friends for a while if they're afraid of affiliating with you when you're attacking some of these big issues. But
Well, and for something,
Then
and you're often, you can be vindicated too, like when Tom, the stories about Tom's neighbors were all poo-pooed at first. And then when the radiation dose estimates were done, turns out Tom's neighborhood, that farm community right across from Hanford, got the highest doses of anybody in the entire region. So it was kind of a, I told you so moment for the downwinders of that neighborhood.
I have a comment about morals.
yeah,
I understand about what, to me, the moral of the story is are we going to hurt others by what we do? And my understanding is that what I don't think we've talked a lot about today is that there was leaks going on, and the contract that was originally made was to they were going to ensure all this that was taking place, the safety precautions, and they didn't. And then it started leaking and started killing people. And so the moral is, I guess it's morally wrong to be so reckless and hurt people. And so I believe it's moral to stand up and say something, because especially when you see dollar signs being passed between groups of people that are deciding the outcome of the accountability.
yeah, that's a good point. Yes. Also, remember, one little person can make a difference. One little person can start others thinking in a certain way. Don't ever feel like you're just one person.
Say something?
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Listen to your inner voice, young man, and it'll talk to you. The inner voice will tell you whether you're doing the right thing. In the depth of despair, when I was most depressed and the most frightened, I was laying in bed and I got a soothing message that said, "You're going to be okay. Keep going." Now that sounds bizarre, but that's all I can say about it. Listen to your first inner voice, the first thing that comes to your head about making a decision on that action. Sounds crazy, I know.
Nope.
We do have another
was crazy.
question. This one is for Bob, and there's another one for Karen. Tricia just referred to second generation sufferers. Bob, did your niece grow up in Portland? That's the first part of the question.
Yes, she did. She grew up in Portland. She still lives in Portland. And she had a pretty healthy life her whole life up until her late 20s. She was diagnosed, and then she went through chemotherapy, and then she ended up now with another disease something that's attacking her kidneys called nephropathy.
Okay, thank you, Bob. And Karen, what disposed you to be so interested in the stories that Tom and the others told?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I have degrees in history in my undergraduate, and I have a master's degree in history. And I read about what happened at the Nevada test site, where the bombs went off, and where they killed thousands of sheep, and then people started getting cancers. So I knew that story. And so I was curious about the farmers and whether something similar could have happened at Hanford. I had no idea at the time. At Hanford, one public relations person Hanford said not one atom has ever escaped from Hanford, which of course was ridiculous, but that's what their stance was at the time. And so it was the fact that there'd been hundreds of sheep deaths in Tom's neighborhood, and then the people I met that very first weekend I spent with him down there, including a Chinese American father of 7 children with a PhD who worked at the Pasco Water District, but who lived in Tom's farm community. And he had seen classified memos from the 1960s about Columbia River whitefish ingesting radioactive potassium from the Hanford plants. But he quit feeding his kids fish after reading that, but he couldn't tell his neighbors because he would have lost his job. They were classified documents. And so there were enough tantalizing things about what Tom was saying, and the fact that, you know, that neighborhood is right across the Columbia from Hanford. It just got me intrigued, and so I went back and started looking for documents and other sources who would help back that story up. One of the most interesting people I met was the health officer of Benton Franklin County back in the 70s. And he was worried about accidents at Hanford, and he recommended distributing potassium iodide pills, you know, that will block the uptake of radiation in case of an accident. He was completely shut down. They said, you propose this and you will lose your job. So just this whole atmosphere there of suppression of facts and suppression of accidents, suppression of the truth, just got to be a bigger and a bigger story.
Mhm.
Thank you. And that leads into this question. It's for each of the participants. Based on your experience with Hanford, what policy would you like to see the government adopt to help or compensate victims of radiation leaks like those at Hanford?
Okay. I would love to, if you don't mind, to just plunge in here. I would like to, rather than see the piecemeal approach that's been used with the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act for certain people surrounding the Nevada test site, plus a few other people, and the Marshall Islands Compensation Program, I would like to see everyone who was downwind of a production or testing site where there was documented radiation release, who lived there during those years, to be treated like the workers are under the Nuclear Workers Compensation Program, which is the EEOI CPA long name. But, you know, if downwinders get any of the same diseases that are recognized as radiogenic for workers, we should be given the benefit of the doubt, just like the workers were, and be compensated for those diseases. It would be so much simpler. One system for Marshall Islands and US exposed people, all exposed to US production and testing fallout. So that's what I would advocate for. Next, who would like to answer next? Karen, do you want to say anything?
Well, I agree with you. I think that would be the way to go. For one thing, lots of these things are layers upon layers. Like, you know, in Eastern Washington, we were also exposed to fallout from the Nevada test site. And as Kate Brown has written in her book, Platopia, and her books about Chernobyl, we're all downwinders in some sense, you know. So if there is a link, and that's one good thing about the Hanford litigation, it wasn't perfect, but it did establish through a few jury trials and also through the small settlements that this is a real thing. You know, some people try to say, oh, the studies showed there are no radiation effects. That is not accurate. Right. And so we really need a more comprehensive national program that addresses this issue and gives help to people who are suffering.
Yeah. Bob or Tom, do you have anything you want to add?
Go ahead, Tom.
This country needs to set out on a plan of Medicare for all. That'll take care of the medical bills for the downwinders, and the compensation should be just like Tricia said. But the most important thing to take away from this is stop the damn uranium mining. Stop it, and that'll help stop it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bob, do you have anything to add?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
I would add that one of the biggest travesties that happened here is that was it the Warner Act, that they were retroactively, the GE or DuPont, I think was able to get out of their original contract liability. It's like 20, 30 years later after the fact. And I would make it to where that these companies are not able to, they're held accountable for what they do instead of being able to get out of it like they did in this case.
We have time for two last questions. This one is from Ken Brownell, who's on his iPad, a cleanup vet exposed to Hanford's plutonium in the Marshall Islands. Regarding the false notion that the US is caring for veterans by giving them land, are the downwinders who are veterans connected with other veteran advocacy groups?
Interesting question. That'd be Bob or Tom probably to answer that, right?
I'm a veteran, but I don't know if the advocacy groups for veterans for Hanford are in,
Yeah.
but
One last question.
There's no veterans group for Hanford. They started one for the Nevada guys, but everybody dies before they get organized.
Hmm.
We're fortunate we got Trish to organize this.
And this final question is for anyone. Do you have any feelings about the role of the Hanford Health Information Network in acknowledging or aiding the downwinders?
Uh,
Go ahead.
It was a feeble attempt and it was poorly managed and it was a failure and I cut the funding on it.
Okay. I have a slightly different outlook on it. There was no help as far as treatment or anything like that, but they did do a lot of research and they did some research into things that were helpful, and they did publish some helpful documents, and they had some centers, not out here. I live in California. The people outside of the Pacific Northwest now didn't get these centers, but there were some centers within the Pacific Northwest where people could go to talk about their experiences, but no treatment, no anything like that. So a little bit different outlook.
Okay. Well, thank you, Trisha, Karen, Tom, and Bob for stopping by and sharing your very important stories with us today. And a huge thank you to our audience for joining in. This event will soon be available on the University Bookstore's YouTube channel, so you can catch it again. And you may purchase copies of Trisha Pritikin's new book, The Hanford Plaintiffs, Voices from the Fight for Atomic Justice, through the University Bookstore website. So have a wonderful night, everyone, and we hope to see you back at one of our other virtual author events.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah.